Welcome to Business Unmuted, sponsored by Virtue Motors, one of the UK's largest motor retailers. Check out its website at virtuemotors.com. I'm Graham Robb and I've owned Recognition PR for nearly 35 years. We've 75 clients in multiple sectors across the UK, and between them they've got turnover of £6 billion and they employ around 30,000 staff. So we're at the front line of the business community, and they're perfectly placed as a result to talk about the economic climate, which we're going to do today on this podcast. In the studio with Bob Borthwick, director at Scott Brothers, one of the northeast of England's leading recycling businesses. And down the line we have Ben Saranko, senior research economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And for later in the programme, when we're looking at issues relating to International Women's Day, we've Catherine Harland, founder of Menopause Mentor, who provides menopause awareness training and education for workplaces to support both managers and employees. So welcome to Business Unmuted, welcome all. Ben, I'm going to start with you. Next week, it's the budget. The Institute of Fiscal Studies absolutely at the heart of providing commentary on these issues. Where do you see a snapshot of the UK economy just 7 days before the budget?
Well, Graham, the good news is that the economy is not in quite so dire straits as was predicted a few months ago. Gas prices have come down faster than expected. The economy has held up a bit better than expected. And so there are some signs of optimism in the short term. I think looking beyond that, the economy is still in quite a difficult position. The public finances are still in quite a difficult position. There are some quite gloomy growth forecasts out there, both historically speaking and compared to other countries. So we're definitely not out of the woods yet. And I think what we'll see in the budget is some notes of cautious optimism from the Chancellor, but a reluctance to make any big permanent tax cuts or spending promises that might not prove to be affordable if things turn out worse than expected.
Of course, budgets are also accompanied by official forecasts. I'm not talking about your forecasts, which are not official, but they're helpful. I'm talking about the Office of Budget Responsibility. Now, if you were to look at the Office of Budget Responsibility's track record on forecasts, it's wildly out by many billions of pounds. And if it had got the predictions of the economy right, the government might have had more money to spend than it actually did when it last had an OBR forecast. What's your view on that? I suppose as an economist you'd probably want to crowd round and defend them, would you?
Forecasting is an art, it's not a science, and it is inherently quite tricky. You're trying to forecast a very complex system with millions of agents and businesses and households all making decisions. It's very difficult to do that with any great degree of accuracy, particularly when you've got things like pandemics or global energy price shocks.
Oh, we're having a little bit of sound disruption on your signal here, Ben. We just had a bit of a brain freeze. I tell you what, we'll re-establish the link with you and go to Bob for a moment in the studio. We were just talking about, you heard what he had to say about that. What do you see the economy like?
Well, the economy's obviously on a downward spiral at the minute, certainly from a point of view, a business point of view.
The only thing worse, Tom.
Go on. Finish your point.
Yeah. So really, it's challenging for businesses in the economy at the moment. Obviously, this pending budget, with its possibilities of corporation tax increases, there's also a fuel duty increase that they carried forward from the last budget. So from our point of view, or certainly Scott Brothers' point of view, that would be quite an impactful issue that we have if those particular tax increases occurred next
And if
week.
they didn't occur, would it make life considerably easier for you?
It would make life easier because we go back to the forecasting that Ben said earlier. The business can forecast on the tax elements that it currently has. If there's a tax change in fuel and corporation tax, then that actually has a knock-on effect for how the business forecasts going on. And obviously that will be whether we invest in certain things, whether we take on new employees, that sort of thing.
Ben, you got interrupted on the signal there, but I think we've got you back now. So could you finish what you were saying about the economic climate? You said it wasn't that good, and I asked you about forecasting. You said it's an art, it's not a science, but it is also important from the point of view of the government because the forecasts will inform the decisions, won't they?
Yes, sorry, I lost you there. What I was going to say is that the only thing worse than in an accurate forecast is having no forecast at all. You've got to base judgments on something, and it's the OBR's job to produce a central forecast upon which we can base our decisions. Now, they're never going to turn out to be perfectly accurate, but they're still a useful guide for where we might expect to be in a few years. And so I wouldn't say that they've always been perfect. They have been rather optimistic on average over the past 10 years, particularly when it comes to things like productivity and investment. And I think that part of the reason why the outlook now looks so gloomy is that we're catching up with that. And we're now recognizing that things haven't turned out that positively over the past 10 years. And we're now revising down our expectations for the future. So imperfect, but useful and important.
Okay, let's just look at a few things that really will contribute to the government's thinking. One of the things is interest rates, because the government obviously has to pay interest on its massive borrowings. And the chairman of the Fed in America is saying completely different things about interest rates than the Bank of England. Just this week, he was saying, front page of the Financial Times this week, that the Fed is going to continue to increase interest rates quite significantly. And that will affect the dollar-pound exchange rate and possibly lead the Bank of England to follow suit. What's your thought on that?
Well, the first thing is, as you said, Graham, that higher interest rates mean that the government has to spend more servicing its debt. Now, this year and the next couple of years, the government's going to be spending many tens of billions of pounds extra on debt interest than what was previously expected. And that's tens of billions that can't then be spent on tax cuts for business or on higher spending on the health service. With regards to the Fed versus the Bank of England, the UK and the US are facing quite different economic circumstances at the moment. The UK is far more exposed to the Russian energy price shock, for example, than the US is. The US's inflation problem is far more domestically fueled. And so that's why you might see them ramping up interest rates to try and reduce that pressure. Whereas the key contribution to inflation here in the UK has been energy and things that we've imported from abroad. So it's a slightly different policy problem. We may well get further increases in interest rates from the Bank of England, but I think it's less nailed on than in the case of the Federal Reserve.
I'd hoped that interest rates were stabilising now, and I think many people in business had. Our shadow MPCs in the North East and in Yorkshire had said about where we are now is about where we should be. But of course the worry is that if the dollar goes up in price against the pound, things like oil and energy are priced in dollars and inflation will be brought in more, pushing our interest rates up more.
There's definitely some merit to that argument. There's no saying in economics that when America sneezes, there's some spillover from the Fed when they make interest rate decisions that we might have to grapple with here in the UK.
Okay. Now, when it comes to tax, Institute of Fiscal Studies, that's about tax and spending, where it all lies. Bob, I'm going to ask Bob about tax first and then get your response. You were saying taxes are too high.
Yeah.
You were saying the planned tax increases on corporation tax is alarming to your business. Let's talk about that. Put it in context for us. It's going up from 19 to
25%. Yeah, so it's going up 6%, which is.
What would it take out your business next year?
Well, obviously it's going to. Immediately, it's going to look at investment. We won't be. We'd be looking at cutting investment in.
But in cash
the
terms,
business.
is it tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands?
In cash terms, it'll be hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
That's quite significant.
Yeah.
In the northeast of England, where the average job is between 24 and 30,000, that's quite a few jobs if it's hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
And you were saying investment.
Yeah.
You've done a lot of investment this year, and
We
you
have.
did it presumably taking advantage of this super deduction scheme that they've got. Just explain that. What
Well,
you
again,
invested in.
I mean that's something that's helped the business invest in plant and equipment. Again, that's going to have a negative effect going forward if that is reduced. And again, we'd be looking at whether we invest in machinery, plant. And
So
all the rest of it.
this sort of incentive to invest clearly worked with you.
Yes. It was a help to us expanding the business at the time.
I wonder if that's because you've got foresight, because still there is an investment lag in the country, isn't there? Not all businesses are really focused on investment the way you are.
No.
And it maybe hasn't worked in the right way. But you are of the view, keep it and continue the incentive.
Keep the status quo, keep with the incentive. You know, it's if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it is broke, then fix it. But I can't see whether it's broke,
All
to
right.
be quite honest, to be fair.
Let's ask Ben. I'm not trying to set you up to argue necessarily with Bob, but maybe you could explain it in what the rationale is about putting corporation tax up. And I know it's not your policy, but what's it work? How would it work for our economy if firms like Bob's don't invest?
Well, the UK has got a chronic low investment problem, and one of the reasons why our economic performance and our productivity hasn't been so great over the past couple of decades is partly due to that low level of investment. I think Bob's touched on something really important, which is, as well as the headline rate, things like the super deduction and things like investment allowances can also be really important here. So one thing we've seen since 20 was reductions in the headline rate of corporation tax, coupled with cutting back the generosity of investment allowances. And combined, that meant that we actually cut the headline rate, but raised a similar amount. Sorry, I'm not sure if my internet's going again.
I can hear you.
Do tell me if so.
Stay on with it.
I'll carry on. So I think where we're at now is potentially going back to a world where we increase the headline rate again, but maybe do more work on investment allowances. For example, making the annual investment allowance is now set to be held at £1 million, considerably higher than where it was before. And we might see further announcements on that in the budget next week, taking that route towards trying to incentivize business investment rather than changes in the headline rate.
I think I can see the rationale in that. But shareholders still need returns, and shareholder returns are subdued if you've taken money away from tax. And that's the other thing, because you need to give incentive for people to actually invest in the companies in the first place. Ben, what about the need for government to raise tax? There are a lot of people, particularly in the Liz Truss part of Conservative politics, who are of the view that you've got to just grit your teeth and cut tax and let the growth happen. The Rishi Sunak part of Conservative politics is more like the Thatcher era of 1981, where they say you get tax under control by making sure you raise enough to pay for your spending. When you've got growth, you give tax cuts. Is that a fair explanation of the dilemma that the government faces?
I think that's definitely a big part of it. The other big thing that we have to recognise is that the pressures on government and government services are considerably greater than at certain points in the past, particularly in a post-pandemic era. Thinking about the pressures on the health service, ongoing pressures from COVID, thinking about the ageing of the population, which adds to pressures on things like pension spending, and now meaning we have to spend more on defence also. So there are big pressures on spending too. And if you want to do big cuts to tax, you've also got to recognise, that comes with implications for how much we can afford to spend on things. And I think people are often much keener to advocate for tax cuts than they are for the spending cuts that might need to accompany them. All
right, Ben, we're going to pause you there because of the line, but thank you very much for your contribution. I'm going to bring you back, Bob, because I know you're you're not doing this for ideological reasons.
No.
But you want the money in your business to invest for you, but you could equally say that the people that represent the nurses want the money in the NHS to pay them a salary increase. How would you square that circle?
I understand the conundrum of the public sector spend. I mean, I know it's easy for me to sit here and say, well, the health service needs reforming, the welfare systems needs reforming. I mean, that's easy for me to say here, but really that needs to happen, in my opinion.
So
that needs to be reformed.
You would say, look, give us the tax cuts, allow us to invest. We'll raise the economy up, but actually take the money and invest it more wisely. Okay, I take the view that Rishi's taking about more caution on the economy, because that's where I land. But I think the latter part, I simply see your point on. It's got to be right. Look, I'm going to turn to our next subject in a minute, but before I do, you were telling us about the investments you're making. What do you see the general economy like? You've talked about tax and your business, but in the Teesside and northeast of England, you're doing quite well, aren't you? There seems to be a lot of activity.
Yeah, we are busy. We are, there's been no slacking from a workload point of view with the business. There is little signs of housing market slowing down because an element of the business is skips, and we're not getting a turnaround on the skips from the developers now. So we've got skips actually stood in this on stock, ready to go out. So there is a sign that things are slowing down out there, but still, it's still very buoyant really at the moment.
My great friend David Smith, who's the economics editor of the Sunday Times, has something he calls the skip index, and he says you can judge an economy by the number of skips in a row.
I think that's the house building sector as well.
Yeah.
To be quite honest, they're a barometer for the economy. If the housing sector starts to slow down, then you know the economy is starting to contract a bit.
Okay, Bob, Ben, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We're going to change the subject to close this edition of Business Unmuted, because today, as we transmit this live, it's Wednesday the 8th of March and it's International Women's Day. This is the Northern Echo front page in the northeast of England. It has 50 women who are excelling for the north of England. They're in sport, they're in politics, they're in business, academia, and it's a brilliant explanation of where women find themselves in our social and our business life at the moment. But there are issues that are peculiar to women that we really also maybe need to address more widely in business. And joining me on the line is Catherine Harland, who's the founder of Menopause Mentor. Now, Menopause Mentor, her service, provides menopause awareness training for workplaces to support managers and employees. Catherine, thank you for joining me. First of all, tell us what the issue is and how it affects workplaces.
Graham, basically, first and foremost, it's not a legal requirement. Businesses are not legally required to have a menopause policy. They obviously have a care of duty under the Equalities Act of 2010, but where it comes to menopause, it's not a legal requirement. Now, only back in January, I think it was January the 24th, the government responded to the Women and Equalities Committee, who'd recommended a lot of things to support women in the workplace, and a lot of that was rejected, including mandatory training for GPs. GPs don't get mandatory training in medical school. So while there's a lot of banging of the drum about how GPs are letting women down, ultimately, the pendulum swung from me thinking this about 5 years ago, thinking this is ridiculous, GPs, shouldn't know more, to think, well, hang on a moment, they're not getting the medical training, mandatory training in menopause. So how on earth are they meant to support? And we know the state of the NHS, it's so super stretched. Where do they have time at the moment to go and do outside external training? I digress. Going back to workplaces, it isn't a legal requirement, but this shouldn't stop any workplace, any organisation, any employer from addressing this situation. This is as critical as mental health. And obviously it goes hand in hand, menopause and mental health. Now, what I will say, there is too much scaremongering narrative out there. It's not my job to frighten workplaces, frighten employers, or drum up employees feeling worried. It's not about that at all. I'll give you some stats from the British Menopause Society. 25% of women will sail through menopause. 25% will have debilitating symptoms, and 50% will have moderate symptoms. So that's 75% that's going to be nothing to moderate. Now, that's quite a high percentage. That's quite satisfactory. The 25% will struggle more and will have more mental health problems, anxiety, depression, low mood, etc. Every woman needs supporting, and every workplace is different. So, go from a supermarket checkout, if you're having a hot flush and you're sat on the till, compared to if you sat in an office where you can just get up and go and get some fresh air, go and get a glass of water. It varies so much from workplace to workplace. And this is what I bring to my sessions. I work with the client. We identify ways of supporting their employees, bringing in different uniforms, if it's a uniform workplace, breathable material. It all sounds quite basic, swapping desks around, sitting near a window, introducing fans. Some things are quite basic to implement and cost effective. There's a lot of things that aren't quite as straightforward. I think it's about knowledge is power. And this is where we're struggling. Some organisations, national organisations, have really embraced this. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention companies on here. Obviously, I'm not advertising. I don't work for any of these, but Specsavers, Boots, Marks and Spencers have really gone full pelt into menopause brain, you see, into supporting employees. And then you've got the other, set of businesses who are either SMEs, they don't understand the implications, but menopause employment tribunals have tripled in the last 2 years. And this is because managers don't know how to address it. Even some HRs, they don't have a menopause policy. They make remarks that they might think is a joke, but obviously it's not a joke to the woman that feels vulnerable, who is then going through menopause and have some challenging symptoms. There's a gap to be bridged. And basically, it's not just about supporting managers and employers. It's also about supporting employees. Now, if an employee doesn't know how to have a healthy menopause, it's no good the manager then knowing how to support them. It's a two-way street. So I'll give you an example. If an employee is still drinking what they used to drink 20 years in their 20s on a weekend, they're going to suffer low mood, anxiety, low energy, fatigue, etc., well into the working week. And that's scientifically proved. Our bodies can't tolerate and get rid of alcohol like it used to be able to. Therefore, if a manager is put in place, or a menopause champion, to oversee employees and they're not performing as well as they used to, they've got to learn that they can't drink as much. They've got to eat less processed food. There's a lot of cogs to the well-being wheel that we have to address, and that managers and employees need to know about, as well as employees. So you can see it's quite it shouldn't be complicated, but it feels a little bit complicated at the moment.
I've got to admit, I didn't realise I knew as much about the menopause as I did until this issue came up with Davina McCall and her television documentary and subsequent book. My late wife, who suffered cancer for nearly 20 years, had cancer drugs in her 30s, which brought on an early menopause or a perimenopause, and then she went through a full menopause in her late 40s and early 50s before she passed away. So I saw that. You can see what the symptoms are when you're close to it, but quite a lot of dealing with it is commonsensical. Does it really need legislation?
I think it does. It shouldn't, but I think the only way to get support in the workplace is by having legislation.
What legislation would you want?
I think companies should have to have a menopause policy. I think it doesn't have to be lengthy and wordy, a straightforward policy. You could even incorporate menopause policy within your existing policy. And that just guides. If a female comes to you, to HR, and says, can I have a look at your menopause policy, our menopause policy, they've got a document there. If we wait for the government to implement this, to put legal requirements in place, we could be waiting a long, long time. And a lot of people will be suffering. When I say people, I mean people, not just women, because 51% of the population will experience menopause. To what level? It varies, as I've just explained. But indirectly, 100% of the population will be affected. Work colleagues, husbands, wives, partners, kids, elderly parents. Everybody is affected by that female who's transitioning.
It's not easy to say when the menopause happens. It happens different for different women. But if you look at the age range above 50, you'll see that there are about 3.5 million people, half of which will be women, economically inactive. So if you are dealing with this issue, you can make an impact on the economy itself, can't you?
Absolutely. And it's perimenopause and menopausal women are the biggest growing demographic in the workplace.
Okay. And would you go as far as Spain in allowing paid time off for menstrual issues and menopause related issues, regardless, self-certified paid time?
Do you know, that's a really difficult one. I mean, I'm speaking as a female, and I'm speaking as one who was in the 25% of debilitating symptoms. So I'm not speaking as someone who was in the 25% of sailing through it, but I've also been an employer. So what I want my employees, in the workplace, if they're really struggling, if they had, apologies for being graphic, but this is life, if they had terrible flooding, they should be allowed to go home.
Yes.
How can you navigate that? That's
Yeah.
really difficult. If it's more minor symptoms, I don't think, if it's manageable, should we say, with some implementations put in place by the workplace, I think the key is in any workplace is to have managers and HR who are understanding.
Well,
I know so many women who they're scared to say that they're suffering, that they're challenged by symptoms, they can't do the work as well as before because they're scared of losing their job. Wow. And I think the pressure is released as soon as you have a menopause-friendly workplace that you can go to a menopause champion or to the HR or your manager to say, look, I'm really struggling today. Can I do flexible working? Can I come in late tomorrow? I've had a terrible sleep, feeling anxious. I do sympathise with employers. Like I say, I have been one. So, employers need to have a reliable workforce. I completely understand. I think with the Davina thing, I think it was brilliant what she's done. She's done 2 programs now. But in the menopause educator world, we feel like, there's a lot of scaremongering narrative and it's gone too far the wrong way. The pendulum has swung and so many women are thinking they need HRT because otherwise they will get osteoporosis, heart disease, all these scary diseases. There's still a lot of scientific evidence that hasn't proved that.
Okay.
So
Well, we won't go into that, but I'm going to have to stop because we're nearly finished, but I want to give you one very important plug, and that is this. Catherine is a fantastic, passionate advocate for this. She knows her stuff, and she will charge just under £600 to come to your business and give a proper talk, a proper session to educate both the managers and workers. And that's a bit of work that's going down very well, isn't it? People are using it in the north of England.
Absolutely. I've worked with some phenomenal organisations. The feedback's been wonderful. And it's essential. Don't wait for the government to make this legal requirement.
That's Catherine Harland, Menopause Mentor. Bob, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks,
Sorry
Ben.
we had connection problems. Let's see what happens in the budget next week. Next week, the Business Unmuted is live from Virtue Motors BMW branch in the north of England, one of their branches, and we'll have an audience, we'll have politicians, we'll have big business leaders, and we'll find out what they thought of the budget Wednesday the 15th of March.